However, as long as we confine the discussion to the example of the theater, and to acts of appropriation that share the same characteristics, it is entirely unnecessary to account for the fact that a knight has a right to be in his seat by invoking the idea that by taking it he has created a new right in it. Pufendorf's denial that taking possession can create a right in something is a denial of a move that Grotius does not make. Grotius never says that people acquire a right in things that they take. He just says they have a right to use them. The knights in the theater, just like passengers on public buses, do not have rights to their seats, nor do they acquire rights in them once they have occupied them. They merely have a liberty to occupy vacant seats. Pufendorf's point is that because there is no obligations to allow the occupants to exercise this liberty, they are unprotected from a second-comer's exercising the same liberty. However, although the knights are not protected by rights in or to their seats, they are not entirely unprotected. Hillel Steiner has written, "While it's true that my exercise of a liberty is not protected by others having duties specifically enjoining them not to interfere with that exercise, it can also be true that the duties they do have may sometimes be such as effectively to rule out such interference." Now, occupying a seat in a theater or a bus can be understood as an example of doing something as well as having something. It entails physical action, and we know from Grotius's discussion in De Jure Belli that as long as people's actions, even their violent actions, do not encroach on the rights of others, they are protected by the natural law duty not to physically harm others. And it seems clear in these cases that eviction or dispossession could not take place without some kind of physical assault, which would undoubtedly be a violation of a right. It is possible to argue, therefore, that there are obligations governing the use of publicly owned things which are not correlative to any rights people have to or in those things, but to the rights that people have to personal integrity. The example of the public theater is particularly apposite for Grotius in the view of what he thinks using the common means, namely, living on the fruits which the earth brought forth of its own accord without toil. Men were then content to dwell in caves, to have the body either naked or clothed with the bark of trees or skins of wild animals. He thus confines the lawful use of the common to the immediate consumption of things that people find growing on the common, and to uses that entail uninterrupted physical possession, such as wearing clothes and using caves for dwelling. He excludes from consideration that at this point things produced by labor and things stored for future use, activities that only begin as a result of a desire for a more refined way of life. Claims to the products of labor and claims to use stores both require the kind of ownership that results from private property as he defines it, because ownership, which begins with possession, is not lost when possession is lost. Rather, ownership gives us the right to recover possession. Ownership of the products of labor and ownership of things which are stored require the right to recover possession after the initial seizure, that is, after the connection of the body with body has been uninterrupted. And as we shall see in the next section, this right requires an agreement. Grotius discusses labor and storage in a passage in which he deploys Aristotle's argument against the Platonic positive community of property to make the point that when people were no longer content to feed off the spontaneous products of nature, but applied industry to the production of things, community of ownership could only be maintained by some kind of sharing. That is, the original negative community would have to be replaced with a kind of positive community. But Grotius says that the practice of gathering the products of the soil into a common store was hindered by the remoteness of the places to which men had made their way, and then by the lack of the justice and kindness. In consequence of such a lack, the proper fairness in making divisions was not observed, either in respect to labor or in the consumption of the fruits. The problem that Grotius is identifying is the absence of satisfactory principle of apportioning collectively owned products. This is a problem associated with the distribution of goods from a common store to which all have contributed. In the context of Grotius's history of the early development of property, it is a problem that is encountered after whole nations have occupied separate countries, but before the division of the land between families or individuals. For this kind of positive community to work harmoniously after people began to labor and store things, they must do more than respect the primitive right. They must live on terms of mutual affection, such as rarely appears. It is not, therefore, an argument about why the original community was abandoned, but why, after the first steps in its abandonment had occurred, a positive community of sharing endured only in exceptional cases. Pufendorf, by contrast, understands the universal use of things to require labor and storage from the start. He says, "Most things which are of use to men immediately and are employed to nourish them and protect their bodies are not produced everywhere by nature and without cultivation in such abundance that they fully suffice for everyone. Therefore, an occasion for quarrels and wars lay ready at hand." The universal use of things thus requires a convention, the effect of which was that whatever one of these things which were left open to all, and of their fruits a man had laid his hands upon, with intent to turn it to his uses, could not be taken from him by another. Furthermore, this first agreement distinguished man from animals, in the respect that every animal takes for his own nourishment everything he first happens upon, and even if any one of them has stored up something for his future use, others are not prevented from seizing them, for the reason that there is no convention among animals which confers a special right over a thing to the one that first got it. The differences between Grotius and Pufendorf, therefore, are the result of different conceptions of what using the common means, and this has created an ambiguity about the meaning of the term seizure. For Grotius, the first uses of the world had the same characteristics as the use of public parks and theaters. They are uses that entail an uninterrupted series of physical actions and are thus protected by a natural right to life, limbs, and liberty. For Pufendorf, the first use of the common entails the removal of things from the common with the intention of future use. And as he rightly says, this is not possible without having some kind of special right in those things. Without such a right, it is lawful for others to seize them once they have become disconnected from the body of the first taker. Private property. When mare liberum, Grotius says that there is a certain kind of ownership inherent in the possession and use of things, he is drawing attention to the fact that under any property regime, whether it is positive community, negative community, or proprietorship, it is a physical necessity that the use of most things excludes others from the same use at the same time, and that people are permanently excluded from the things that are used up. If this certain kind of ownership implies the existence of rights that are not categorically different from exclusive property rights, then there is no categorical difference between using the common and occupying it. However, for Grotius, the transition from the use of things in common to private property is from an exclusion that results from the physical presence of another, or from the fact that the thing used becomes part of the very substance of the user, to exclusion that results from a right to recover possession after possession is relinquished. And this is a right that no one had under the primitive right to use things in common. The transition to private property was a gradual extension of the duty to abstain brought about by reason and decision. The first step was when the duty to abstain was extended from the things that are used up by use to other things, such as clothes and movables, which are not entirely consumed by use, but that, by use, they become less fit for future use. Grotius then says that once this extension has come about, not even immovables, such, for instance, as fields, could remain unappropriated. Unapportioned. For although the land is not consumed, its use is bound up with subsequent consumption. Since fields are used to produce food and pasture lands to raise animals that produce clothing, and crucially, the use of land requires exclusion because there's not enough land for everyone's indiscriminate use. We must, of course, understand these developments in the context of Grotius' discussions in De Jure Belli of the transition from the simple life to a more refined way of life, which is only possible with more extended forms of exclusion and abstinence. Grotius concludes from this that when property or ownership was invented, the law of property was established to imitate nature. Occupation is an imitation of nature in the sense that the idea of ownership first arises through its connection with acts of seizure to satisfy bodily needs, and so by a similar connection it was decided that things were the property of individuals. Grotius then argues that the positive laws governing occupation must always reflect this connection in two ways. First, since occupation of consumables take place through physical seizure, occupation of things of the second and third categories must also take place through seizure. Second, occupation can only apply to those things the use of which is impossible without using them up. So, resources that cannot be physically seized and those that cannot be used up cannot become private property. On both accounts, Grotius reaches his primary conclusion that the sea cannot become a property of the individual or nation.